I've said this about Bob Ferguson, I won't belabor the point, but he is going to have some tests ahead of him as the legislative session progresses. It's a long session. So remember, they have short sessions in Olympia and long sessions. This is a 105-day session, so it's longer. So throughout the session, of course, you're going to have some of, like maybe the bill we just talked about, 1178, where they're trying to take it easy on criminals. He's acting like a moderate. The test is going to be when these very, very not moderate bills make it to his desk. And we know one of what seems to be a top priority for Democrats is rent control. They gave it a hearing the first day of the session. It is already progressing through the legislature. They have the majorities to be able to push rent control, to cap rent increases at a time when we have a housing crisis in this state. At a time when landlords are already selling their units, they're being purchased by single families to be single family homes out of the rental pool entirely because of things like that. And so Bob is saying on one hand, hey, we're in a housing crisis. He's trying to lift red tape to be able to build more houses. And then on the other side, Democrats are working behind the scenes, his own party, to send rent control to his desk. That's going to be, I think, the biggest test of Bob Ferguson's newfound moderacy, is whether he's going to be willing to sign rent control in Washington state into law. And so the other aspect of this that I wanted to talk about today, we're joined by Morgan Irwin. So Morgan, he's going to probably, the name and he is going to look familiar to you. He's a former state lawmaker, but Morgan now works for the Association of Washington Businesses. And businesses have a huge stake in this because you need workforce housing. If we find ourselves in an even worse housing crisis, it directly impacts the economy. If you have any businesses that want to come here, that want to grow here, and there's not enough housing for their workforce, then it's just not an option for them. So there's so many things wrapped up in this, including the success of businesses. So Morgan Irwin, again with the Association of Washington Businesses, was nice enough to come on with us and talk about this fight over rent control. Morgan Irwin, welcome to Undivided.
Thanks for having me on, Brandi.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about rent control. I mean, we've discussed a lot on the show about how it's just a bad idea, just a horrible idea. But let's just work on the assumption that maybe it's going to pass. We know Democrats, if they want something to pass, it'll pass and it'll get signed by the governor. What impact, I guess, would that have on Washington state, maybe comparatively to surrounding states?
Sure. So just backing up just slightly before that, in Olympia, we almost never agree that we even have a problem. And when it comes to housing, not only does pretty much everybody agree that we have a problem, but they even agree on what the cause of the problem is. And that never happens politically, right? Where both sides are like, oh, we have a problem and we agree on what it is. And in Washington state, we have a housing crisis. And that's driven by supply. We don't have enough supply. Bob Ferguson's come in. He said he wants to build 200,000 housing units in his first term. Estimates show that we need 1.1 million new housing units in Washington state in the next 2 decades. And this is kind of universally agreed upon. So will rent control help this fundamental driver of this housing crisis in Washington state? And what we would say is no. Does this help people who have a current rental or that would rent in the next couple of years? Potentially, in the short term, that you can see some positive impacts for a very small group of people. But will it help anybody else? And again, the answer is no. I represent Association of Washington Business. We've got about 7,000 business members statewide, everybody from the really big guys, Walmart, Amazon, Microsoft, down to mom and pop tire shop. 65% of our members are 10 employees or less. And so representing kind of the entire state and talking to our membership on a really regular basis, we've got some large developers who've said hey, we build in 5, 6, 7 states. If Washington state puts this in, we won't build in Washington state. Right now on the West Coast of America, California has rent control in place. Oregon has rent control in place. If Washington was to adopt this version of rent control, it would be the most restrictive version of rent control on the entire West Coast, making us not only go from being the most attractive place to potentially build these large projects to being the least attractive place, the least profitable place to build any sort of multifamily housing. And I can go through the stats and the numbers between Washington, Oregon, and California.
Yeah, and as far as the Association of Washington Business, I imagine you have a dog in the fight because you need workforce housing.
Absolutely. That's a huge problem that we work on all the time. And a lot of people think of that in terms of our large urban centers, hey, we don't have enough workforce housing and people have to commute a long ways. it gets even worse if you go to a place like Goldendale or go to any of our smaller, more rural communities where we're bringing in industry. Simplot's going to build a new plant, or one of the other major manufacturers is going to build a new plant. It's going to employ a bunch of people. It'll really change that economy for the better in that area. But there's no housing within, 50 miles, and trying to get those projects built, in a state that's saying, hey, we don't want you to be profitable as an operator of these multifamily properties. It's just really hard because the economics aren't there if we take them away.
It's interesting because I mean, the issues are related, obviously, and there's correlation between the two of them. But I think some Democrats see them as completely independent, like, oh, rents are high, and like the housing issue and the availability of housing and the supply is like a different issue, and they blame you for rents being high. I mean, you talked about some of your members, Amazon. They blame Amazon for rents being high. And so what they want to do is artificially cap it because they almost think it's sort of this well, the rich people are doing it, intentionally and driving up rents or whatever it is. But what's your retort when they say the business community is what's driving up rents?
The Bob Ferguson put together transition teams, various transition teams for various different topic areas. I served on one that was specific to housing that our Lieutenant Governor, Denny Heck, ran. And one of the presentations he brought in was the Low Income Housing Alliance. And this is generally a more kind of center left or left organization that's really focused on low income housing and tenants' rights, and trying to help them. But then they also operate a large number of buildings and units statewide. And these are generally government subsidized rents, and oftentimes government subsidized buildings that were built with grant funds because they're focused on that low income piece. And what Lehigh presented to the group is that a large number of their projects that have all these subsidies for the renter, subsidies for the builder, subsidies for the operator, they're at risk of shutting these buildings down because they're losing millions and millions and millions of dollars a year. They can't force people to pay rent. They can't evict people when they don't pay rent. They can't evict tenants that pose a danger to their other tenants, or to themselves. And so it's really a layered problem where we have the building side of things, and that's very important. And then you have the tenant side of things, and then the other side is operations. And so that's the Real Estate Landlord Tenant Act. And in Washington State, we adopted some really draconian codes during COVID. Some of them have eased, but many of them have stayed in place. And trying to make a building profitable, where you have to assume that 10 or 20% of people aren't going to pay rent and you can't evict them, means that you're going to raise the rents in those other units. And that's not something that any operator wants to do. They'd rather have a building of people that are at market rate and everybody pays their rent.
Mm-hmm.
And then they can bring those profit margins down to something that's going to have a solid return for their investors, but they don't have to gouge, anywhere else. So it's really a layered problem. It's never just one thing when it comes to housing, but that for that stool, those are kind of the three pillars of like, we need to protect tenants. 52% of Washingtonians are renters, and many of our employers and employees are renters, and we're sensitive to that, and we don't want them to be taken advantage of because then they don't want to live here. But we have to have a place for them to live. And if our operators aren't willing to build new buildings to house those folks, then there's no place for them to be.
Yeah, it is a layered problem. It's like a perfect storm, and it's hard for me to fathom why the majority in Olympia doesn't kind of see the storm that they've created and how it's actually making all the problems they say they care about worse. Really quickly, because you mentioned, so you were on the team that the now governor had Denny Heck run in his transition team to look at the issue of housing. And of course, he talked a lot about that. He came out with his executive order to try to cut down on sort of red tape and building time and all of that, which in theory would drive down the price of buying a new home. But rent control and the new governor's goals to expand housing are completely in conflict with one another. I don't know whether he'd sign rent control if it came to his desk, but did you get any sort of sense on that transition committee whether the governor would sign a rent control policy?
I I did not get a direct sense of that. His housing advisor for his team is coming from the Tacoma area, so he just brought him in, and that was announced. And he's lived through Prop 1 in Tacoma and the repercussions for that city and their rental market. So he's got a really very much a boots on the ground, like, hey, been there, done that, seen what this does. and it's been a little bit of a disaster in Tacoma. So I think he's got a pretty good advisor there. Now, whether or not he chooses to rely on the science and the experience that we have that says, hey, this really doesn't work, or is kind of engulfed in the larger political moment, where there's a lot of energy around this. I can't say, but it's going to be one of his first really big tests of, hey, am I a data-driven, science-driven governor who's trying to do the best? Or, is there just tremendous amount of pressure from one side or the other that's going to force decisions? And we've yet to see who Bob's going to be, or who Governor Ferguson's going to be on that. And the political nerd in me is somewhat excited to see that, and how that ratchets out. Obviously his speech at the beginning of session was, I think, somewhat optimistic for a lot of folks on the right side throughout Washington State. Folks who listen to that, folks who haven't, it's worth a look. I think Republicans stood more than Democrats did during that speech. But that we're not going to really know where the rubber meets the road until we get to see whether or not he's signing these bills, whether or not he's going to veto them. He's been much more engaged than the previous administration. Many of his staff, are actively seeking input, going out, talking to experts, and really trying to have real answers as opposed to just being somewhat apathetic, which is kind of what we ran into with the last guy.
Yeah, I share your opinion that I would like to see if he'd sign rent control, because it seems now so antithetical to what the person he's been the last couple weeks. But I don't want to risk it. Like, I don't want it to get that far. I'd rather they just sort of set it to the side before it even gets there.
I think your political moment of the year was when Inslee said that he didn't know the CHOP was happening in Seattle.
Yeah,
The
a couple years
news to
ago.
me quote
Right.
that I don't think we're going to get that from this governor.
I
This
hope
governor is
not.
much more engaged, and his staff is much more engaged, which is a positive thing, whichever direction he goes. But in terms of the real pressure test of, hey, are you willing to stand up to what is largely a liberal movement, not exclusively, and say, hey, the science doesn't support your desires, and we think it's better for the state to go in this other way. We don't know yet, and that's a hell of a test.
I agree. And I don't know if he's going to pass it, but I hope he does if it comes down to it. Morgan Irwin, thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Did I say I hope he does if he comes down? I don't mean that. I hope he doesn't if it comes down to it. Although, man, having Bob Ferguson be saddled with rent control would be kind of nice. It's like this constant pull I have between like what's best for the state and, not preferring Bob Ferguson as a governor. So we'll see what happens with rent control, and it's moving quickly. So we're going to be following that. That segment is brought to you by our partners with the Rental Housing Association of Washington. It's why we've been focusing on rent control so much. It's an issue we care a lot about. It's an issue that would devastate the housing landscape in Washington and would ultimately get rid of options for renters. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. If you are a small to mid-sized landlord, become a member of RHA today, rhawa.org, rhawa.org.